based on the content of Natasha and Her Illegitimate Child in a Muslim Society by Dr. A. Ahmed. The novel is driven by a series of intense and multi-layered conflicts. Here are the key conflicts that shape the narrative. 1. Individual versus society. Natasha's existence as an illegitimate child and later as a woman who becomes pregnant outside of marriage places her in direct conflict with the rigid, patriarchal, and religious norms of Sudanese Muslim society. The stigma of illegitimacy, honor, and shame leads to repeated threats of violence, social ostracism, and, ultimately, fatal punishment. 2. Family versus family, honor feud. Natasha's family is torn apart by the demands of honor. Her father, Sammy, and mother, Nadia, struggle to protect her from extended family members who believe she must be killed to restore family honor. The extended family's insistence on honor killing versus the parents' compassion creates a deadly internal family conflict. 3. Individual versus religious law. Natasha is prosecuted and ultimately executed under Sharia law for adultery, despite being a victim of manipulation and abuse. The novel contrasts the harshness of religious law with secular, humanitarian values, especially when Natasha's case is compared to Brittany's in Canada. 4. Victim versus abuser. The ongoing abuse, manipulation, and betrayal by Yasser, Natasha's abuser and the father of her children, is a central conflict. Yasser's lack of remorse and continued predatory behavior drive much of Natasha's suffering. Yasser's actions also create conflict with his other wives and the broader community. 5. Women versus
patriarchy.
The novel exposes the systemic oppression of women through practices like honor killings, female genital mutilation, forced marriage, and the criminalization of abortion and adoption. Natasha, her mother, and other female characters resist or suffer under these patriarchal structures. 6. Identity and belonging. Natasha's struggle as a half-caste, mixed Russian and Sudanese, and as an outcast in both Muslim and Christian communities highlights the conflict of identity, belonging, and exile. Her son, Gergis, faces similar rejection and discrimination as an illegitimate child raised in a Christian orphanage. 7. Truth versus silence. The pressure to remain silent about abuse, rape, and family secrets is a recurring conflict. Natasha's decision to speak out, even at great personal risk, is a major turning point. The novel explores the cost of breaking silence in a society that demands secrecy. 8. East versus West/tradition versus modernity. The contrast between Sudanese and broader Muslim traditions and Western secular values is explored through the parallel stories of Natasha in Sudan and Brittany in Canada. The different legal and social responses to similar situations, pregnancy out of wedlock, abuse, highlight this cultural conflict. 9. Personal trauma and psychological conflict. Natasha's journey is marked by deep psychological trauma, guilt, and the search for dignity and redemption. The legacy of violence, betrayal, and loss affects her mental health and sense of self. In summary, the novel is a tapestry of conflicts, personal, familial, societal, religious, and cultural, that together critique the systems of oppression and highlight the resilience of those who resist them. The story is as much about Natasha's fight for survival and dignity as it is a broader indictment of the structures that perpetuate violence and silence. Here's a comparative analysis of Natasha and Brittany's experiences based on the novel Natasha and Her Illegitimate Child in a Muslim Society by Dr. A. Ahmed. 1. Legal and social context. Natasha, Sudan. Natasha is a young woman in a conservative Muslim society, Sudan, where Sharia law and strict social codes govern sexuality, honor, and family. She is impregnated twice out of wedlock by Yasser, an older, married neighbor who manipulates and abuses her. Her pregnancies are treated as crimes, adultery, not as evidence of her victimization. Natasha faces public trial, social stigma, threats of honor killing, and, ultimately, fatal punishment, 200 lashes, resulting in her death. Brittany, Canada. Brittany is a 14-year-old Canadian girl, also impregnated by Yasser, who has immigrated to Canada. Canadian law is secular, rights-based, and protective of minors. Brittany is treated as a victim of statutory rape and exploitation. She receives legal protection, social support, and the option for abortion. Yasser is prosecuted and imprisoned. 2. Treatment by family and society. Natasha. Her family is torn between love and the overwhelming pressure to restore honor. Extended family and society focus on punishing Natasha rather than holding Yasser accountable. Natasha's parents try to protect her, but are ultimately powerless against the combined forces of tradition, law, and violence. Brittany. Brittany's family background is troubled, but the state steps in to protect her. She is placed in foster care, and her well-being is prioritized. The focus is on rehabilitation and protection, not punishment. 3. Legal outcomes. Aspect Natasha, Sudan, Brittany, Canada. Legal system Sharia, honor/religion-based secular, rights-based. Victim's status criminalized, punished, protected, rehabilitated. Perpetrator initially escapes, later prosecuted, imprisoned. Trial religious court, public, no defense due process, legal defense. Punishment victim flogged to death, perpetrator imprisoned. Societal attitude stigma, pressure for honor, killing, sympathy for victim. Gender dynamics patriarchal, women bear honor burden, gender-neutral laws. 4. Psychological and personal impact. Natasha suffers lifelong trauma, social ostracism, and repeated cycles of violence and exile. Bears the brunt of her community's judgment, while Yasser largely escapes accountability. Her story ends in tragedy, but also serves as a critique of the systems that destroyed her. Brittany experiences trauma and exploitation, but is recognized as a victim and given a chance for recovery. The system aims to protect her and punish the abuser. 5. Broader themes. Natasha's case exposes the dangers and injustices of a system where honor, religion, and patriarchy override compassion and justice for victims. Brittany's case demonstrates the protective, rights-based approach of Western law, highlighting the importance of child protection and individual rights. Summary table. Aspect Natasha, Sudan, Brittany, Canada. Legal system Sharia, honor/religion-based secular, rights-based. Victim's status criminalized, punished, protected, rehabilitated. Perpetrator initially escapes, later prosecuted, imprisoned. Trial religious court, public, no defense due process, legal defense. Punishment victim flogged to death, perpetrator imprisoned. Societal attitude stigma, pressure for honor, killing, sympathy for victim. Gender dynamics patriarchal, women bear honor burden, gender-neutral laws. In conclusion, Natasha and Brittany's experiences are parallel in their victimization by the same abuser, but their fates diverge dramatically due to the legal, cultural, and social systems in which they live. The novel uses their stories to critique injustice and highlight the urgent need for compassion and reform. In Natasha and Her Illegitimate Child in a Muslim Society by Dr. A. Ahmed, Yasser is the central antagonist whose actions drive much of the conflict and suffering in both Natasha's and Brittany's stories. Here's a detailed look at his role in both narratives. Yasser's role in Natasha's story, Sudan. Predator and abuser, Yasser is Natasha's older neighbor in Sudan. He manipulates and deceives her when she is only 14, initiating a sexual relationship that results in her first pregnancy. He exploits her innocence and the lack of protection from her family. Catalyst for tragedy, his actions set off a chain of events that devastate Natasha's family. Her pregnancy leads to social disgrace, threats of honor killing, and ultimately, the murder of her mother and Natasha's own execution by Sharia law. Ongoing threat, even after the initial crisis, Yasser continues to haunt Natasha's life, reappearing and causing further trauma, including a second pregnancy. He repeatedly escapes accountability, using social and religious loopholes. Symbol of patriarchal abuse, Yasser embodies the dangers of unchecked male authority and religious hypocrisy. He manipulates religious and social norms to justify his actions, including polygamy, sexual exploitation, and abandonment of his responsibilities. Transformation into extremist. Later, Yasser reinvents himself as a religious leader and terrorist mastermind, using his power to orchestrate further harm against Natasha and others. No remorse. Throughout the novel, Yasser never shows genuine remorse for his actions. He consistently justifies or denies his behavior, escalating his abuse and violence. Yasser's role in Brittany's story, Canada. Predator and manipulator. After immigrating to Canada, Yasser targets Brittany, a vulnerable 14-year-old runaway. He gains her trust, supplies her with drugs and alcohol, and initiates a sexual relationship, resulting in her pregnancy. Exploiter of systems, Yasser exploits Brittany's vulnerability and the Canadian welfare system, forging documents and planning to smuggle her out of the country to marry her in the Middle East. Criminal offender, his actions lead to his arrest and conviction for kidnapping, rape, providing drugs to a minor, and other serious charges. He is sentenced to 15 years in prison. Contrast in accountability. Unlike in Sudan, where Yasser largely escapes punishment, in Canada he is prosecuted and imprisoned, highlighting the difference in legal and social responses between the two societies. Yasser as a bridge between the two stories. Common antagonist. Yasser is the abuser in both Natasha's and Brittany's stories, linking the two narratives across continents and legal systems. Embodiment of systemic failure. In Sudan, Yasser's actions are enabled by patriarchal and religious structures that blame and punish the victim. In Canada, the secular legal system recognizes and punishes his crimes, but only after significant harm is done. Agent of trauma. In both stories, Yasser's predatory behavior causes lasting trauma, not only to the direct victims, but also to their families and communities. Symbol of cultural conflict. Yasser's ability to manipulate both religious and secular systems exposes the dangers of cultural misunderstandings and the challenges of integrating individuals with vastly different moral codes. In summary, Yasser is the central antagonist whose predatory, manipulative, and violent actions are the catalyst for the suffering of both Natasha and Brittany. He represents the intersection of personal evil and systemic failure, and his character is used by the author to critique both the patriarchal structures of Sudanese society and the vulnerabilities within Western systems. If you'd like, I can provide specific examples or passages from the novel illustrating Yasser's role, or further analyze how his character evolves throughout the story. Yasser's actions in Sudan and Canada are both predatory and destructive, but the context and consequences differ sharply between the two countries. Here's a comparative analysis. Yasser's actions in Sudan. Predatory manipulation. Yasser, as an older neighbor, targets Natasha, a 14-year-old girl, manipulating her into a sexual relationship under false promises of love and marriage. Abuse and abandonment. He impregnates Natasha, then flees when her family and community seek retribution, leaving her to face the consequences alone. Exploitation of patriarchy. Yasser uses his status as a man and religious justifications to escape accountability, while Natasha bears the full weight of social and legal punishment. Polygamy and serial abuse. He marries multiple women, manipulates and abuses them, and continues to evade responsibility for his actions. Escaping justice. When finally threatened with legal punishment, stoning for adultery, Yasser flees Sudan, exploiting the chaos and legal loopholes to avoid consequences. Transformation into extremist. Later, Yasser reinvents himself as a religious leader and terrorist, using his power to orchestrate further harm. Consequences in Sudan. Yasser largely escapes punishment due to patriarchal and religious structures that blame and punish the female victim. Natasha is criminalized, publicly flogged to death, and her family is destroyed. Yasser's actions are enabled by a system that prioritizes family honor and male authority over justice and compassion. Yasser's actions in Canada. Targeting vulnerable minors, Yasser preys on Brittany, a 14-year-old runaway, supplying her with drugs and alcohol and initiating a sexual relationship. Manipulation and control. He forges documents, plans to smuggle Brittany out of the country, and tries to exploit Canadian legal loopholes to marry her. Criminal behavior. Yasser's actions include kidnapping, rape, unlawful imprisonment, providing substances to a minor, and forgery. System exploitation. He attempts to manipulate the Canadian welfare and immigration systems for personal gain. Legal accountability. Unlike in Sudan, Yasser is arrested, prosecuted, and sentenced to 15 years in prison for his crimes against Brittany. Consequences in Canada. The Canadian legal system recognizes Brittany as a victim and Yasser as a perpetrator. Yasser faces real legal consequences, imprisonment, and the threat of deportation, later revoked due to risk of execution in Sudan. The system prioritizes child protection and individual rights, in stark contrast to the Sudanese context. Key contrasts. Aspect Sudan, Natasha, Canada, Brittany. Victim Natasha, 14, manipulated, punished. Brittany, 14, manipulated, protected. Yasser's tactics: emotional manipulation, religious/patriarchal exploitation, polygamy, abandonment, emotional manipulation, substance abuse, forgery, kidnapping. System response: victim criminalized, Yasser escapes, victim protected, Yasser prosecuted. Legal outcome: Yasser flees, becomes extremist, Yasser imprisoned. Societal attitude: focus on family honor, blame on woman, focus on child protection, blame on abuser. Summary. In Sudan, Yasser's predatory actions are enabled and excused by a patriarchal, religiously governed society. He escapes justice, while Natasha is destroyed by the system. In Canada, Yasser's similar predatory behavior leads to his arrest and imprisonment. The system protects the victim and holds the abuser accountable. Yasser's character thus serves as a bridge between the two stories, exposing the failures of both patriarchal/religious and secular/legal systems, but also highlighting the greater protection and justice available in a rights-based society. Based strictly on the content of the novel. Yasser's character evolution. Step by step. 1. Early life and introduction. Yasser is introduced as a notorious womanizer in Sudan, already married young through family arrangement, but never emotionally attached to his wife. He is depicted as selfish, manipulative, and predatory, always seeking new conquests and using charm and deceit to get what he wants. 2. Predator and abuser. Yasser's predatory nature escalates when he targets Natasha, a vulnerable 14-year-old neighbor. He manipulates her into a sexual relationship, promising love and marriage. After impregnating Natasha, he abandons her to face the consequences alone, fleeing when her family seeks retribution. 3. Exploiter of patriarchy and religion. Yasser uses religious and cultural justifications to excuse his actions and maintain control over women, including polygamy and abandonment. He marries multiple women, manipulates them for financial and personal gain, and continues to evade responsibility. 4. Escalation and evasion. When threatened with legal punishment, stoning for adultery, Yasser flees Sudan, exploiting legal loopholes and chaos to escape justice. He reinvents himself in Egypt and later Canada, adapting his tactics to new environments, but never changing his core predatory behavior. 5. Transnational predator. In Canada, Yasser targets Brittany, a vulnerable 14-year-old runaway, using drugs, alcohol, and emotional manipulation to control her. He forges documents, plans to smuggle her out of the country, and continues his pattern of abuse and exploitation. 6. Facing legal consequences. Unlike in Sudan, Yasser is arrested, prosecuted, and imprisoned in Canada for his crimes against Brittany, including kidnapping, rape, and providing substances to a minor. This marks a turning point where, for the first time, Yasser faces real consequences for his actions. 7. Transformation into extremist. While in prison, Yasser undergoes a religious transformation, joining an Islamic group and becoming more devout in practice. He emerges from prison as a radicalized religious leader, using his charisma and knowledge to gain influence within immigrant and Muslim communities. 8. Mastermind and terrorist. Yasser leverages his new status to orchestrate terrorist plots, using his power and connections to cause further harm. He becomes a symbol of the dangers of unchecked power, misogyny, and religious extremism. 9. No remorse, no redemption. Throughout his evolution, Yasser never shows genuine remorse for his actions. He consistently justifies, denies, or rationalizes his behavior. Even as he gains power and influence, he remains fundamentally unchanged in his lack of empathy and accountability. Summary table: Yasser's evolution. Stage key traits/actions. Early life womanizer, manipulative, selfish. Predator/abuser targets underage girls, abandons victims. Patriarchy exploiter uses religion/culture to justify abuse. Escalation/evasion flees justice, reinvents self in new countries. Transnational predator repeats abuse in Canada, targets vulnerable minors. Facing consequences arrested, imprisoned in Canada. Religious transformation radicalized in prison, becomes extremist leader. Mastermind/terrorist orchestrates terrorist plots, gains influence. No remorse/no redemption, never repents, continues cycle of harm. Conclusion. Yasser's character arc is a study in the escalation of predatory behavior enabled by patriarchal, religious, and legal systems and the consequences, or lack thereof, in different societies. He evolves from a local abuser to a transnational predator and ultimately a radicalized leader, but at his core, he remains unchanged, manipulative, remorseless, and destructive. Yasser's radicalization is a significant turning point in his character arc. Here's how and what triggers his radicalization, according to the novel. Triggering factors for Yasser's radicalization. 1. Imprisonment in Canada. After being convicted for his crimes against Brittany in Canada, kidnapping, rape, providing drugs to a minor, etc., Yasser is sent to a maximum security penitentiary. In prison, he is exposed to dangerous gang culture and is at risk due to his status as a sexual offender. For protection and belonging, Yasser joins a group of Muslim inmates who form a religious gang, known as the Gang of the Battle of Badr. 2. Search for identity and protection. Yasser's lack of community and the threat of violence from other inmates push him to seek safety and identity within the Muslim group. The group offers him protection, a sense of brotherhood, and a new purpose. 3. Indoctrination and religious influence. Within the prison, Yasser is indoctrinated by radical Muslim inmates. He is taught a strict, militant interpretation of Islam, focusing on jihad, martyrdom, and hatred of non-Muslims. He memorizes verses from the Quran and hadiths that emphasize violence, jihad, and the rewards of martyrdom, such as the promise of 72 virgins in paradise. 4. Personal grievance and victim mentality. Yasser begins to see himself as a victim of Western injustice, imprisoned and stigmatized for actions he rationalizes through his cultural and religious background. He blames Western society for his downfall and becomes receptive to the idea that he is being persecuted for his faith and identity. 5. Transformation and new purpose. Over time, Yasser adopts a new, radical religious identity. He emerges from prison as a radicalized religious leader, using his charisma and knowledge to gain influence within immigrant and Muslim communities. He leverages his new status to orchestrate terrorist plots, becoming a mastermind and symbol of religious extremism. Summary. Yasser's radicalization is triggered by a combination of the isolating and violent environment of prison, the need for protection and belonging, exposure to radical religious ideology, a sense of grievance and victimhood, and the opportunity to reinvent himself as a leader with power and purpose. This transformation is not depicted as a sudden change, but as a gradual process fueled by his circumstances and the influences around him in prison. Yasser's radical beliefs are heavily influenced by specific verses from the Quran and Hadiths. Sayings of the Prophet Muhammad that are cited and discussed in the novel, especially during his time in prison and subsequent radicalization. Here are the main verses and religious references that shape Yasser's worldview and justify his actions. Quranic verses influencing Yasser. Jihad and violence against non-believers.
Surah Al-Baqarah 2, 191-193.
And slay them wherever you find them, and drive them out of the places whence they drove you out, for persecution of Muslims is worse than slaughter of non-believers, and fight them until persecution is no more, and religion is for Allah.
Surah Al-Baqarah 2, 244.
Then fight in the cause of Allah, and know that Allah heareth and knoweth all things.
Surah Al-Baqarah 2, 216.
Fighting is prescribed for you, and you dislike it. But it is possible that you dislike a thing which is good for you, and that you love a thing which is bad for you. But Allah knoweth, and you know not.
Surah Al-Anfal pukul 8:12.
I will cast terror into the hearts of those who disbelieve. Strike off their heads and strike off every fingertip of them.
Surah Al-Tawbah 9:5.
So when the sacred months have passed away, then slay the idolaters wherever you find them, and take them captives and besiege them, and lie in wait for them in every ambush.
Surah Al-Tawbah pukul 9:29.
Fight those who believe neither in Allah nor the last day, nor hold that forbidden which hath been forbidden by Allah and His Messenger, nor acknowledge the religion of truth, even if they are of the people of the book, until they pay the jizya with willing submission, and feel themselves subdued. Rewards for martyrdom.
Surah Al-Duhan 44:51-54.
We shall marry them unto the Hurriyat girls, fair ones with wide, lovely eyes.
Surah Al-Rahman 55-56-58-72.
Therein maidens resting their glances, untouched before them by any man or jinn. Lovely girls as rubies, beautiful as coral. The beautiful virgins, the Hurriyat, with large eyeballs, kept close in their pavilions.
Surah Al-Muzammil 73-33.
And maidens of swelling breasts, kawaib, like of same age, and a cup overflowing. Hadiths and other religious texts. On jihad and martyrdom. A man came to Allah's apostle and said, "Instruct me as to such a deed as equals jihad in reward." He replied, "I do not find such a deed." Sahih al-Bukhari. Allah's apostle said, "There is no migration after the conquest of Mecca, but only jihad. When you are called by the Muslim ruler for jihad fighting, you should go forth immediately, responding to the call." Sahih al-Bukhari. The Messenger of Allah said, "I have been commanded to fight against people till they testify that there is no God but Allah, that Muhammad is the Messenger of Allah." Sahih Muslim. The Prophet said, "Striving in the path of Allah, jihad, is incumbent on you along with every Muslim ruler, whether he is pious or not." Sunan Abu Dawud. The Prophet said, "Three things are the roots of faith: to refrain from killing a person who utters, 'There is no God but Allah,' and not to declare him infidel whatever sin he commits, and not to excommunicate him from Islam for his any action. And jihad will be performed continuously since the day Allah sent me as a prophet until the day the last member of my community will fight with the Dajjal, the Antichrist." Sunan Abu Dawud. On violence and terror. Allah's apostle said, "I have been made victorious with terror." Sahih al-Bukhari. The Prophet was asked whether it was permissible to attack the pagan warriors at night with the probability of exposing their women and children to danger. The Prophet replied, "They, women and children, are from them, pagans." Sahih al-Bukhari. The Prophet said, "Killing unbelievers is a small matter to us." Al-Tabari. The morning after the murder of Ashraf, the Prophet declared, "Kill any Jew who falls under your power." Al-Tabari. On apostasy. Whoever changed his religion, kill him. Sahih al-Bukhari. The blood of a Muslim who confesses that none has the right to be worshipped but Allah alone, and that I am his apostle, cannot be shed except in 3 cases: in cases for murder, the married Muslim person who commits the act of adultery, and the one who reverts from Islam and leaves the Muslims Sahih Muslim. How these verses influence Yasser. Justification for violence. Yasser interprets these verses and hadiths as divine commands to wage jihad, use violence against non-Muslims and apostates, and seek martyrdom. Promise of rewards. The promise of paradise and virgins for martyrs motivates his willingness to orchestrate and participate in terrorism. Sense of victimhood and duty. He sees himself as a defender of Islam, justified in violence against those he perceives as enemies or traitors to the faith. No remorse. These texts reinforce his lack of empathy or guilt, as he believes he is fulfilling religious obligations. Impact of the Quranic verses and hadiths on Yasser's actions is profound and direct. Here's how these beliefs shape and drive his behavior throughout the story. 1. Justification for violence and abuse. Yasser interprets verses about jihad, violence against non-believers, and the rewards of martyrdom as divine commands. This gives him a sense of religious legitimacy for manipulating, abusing, and abandoning women, including Natasha and Brittany, justifying sexual exploitation and polygamy, rationalizing violence against those he sees as enemies of Islam, including apostates and non-Muslims. Example from the novel. Yasser repeatedly uses religious rhetoric to excuse his predatory actions, claiming that his behavior is sanctioned by Islamic law and tradition. He manipulates religious texts to maintain control over his wives and justify abandoning his responsibilities. 2. Escalation to extremism and terrorism. The verses promising rewards for jihad and martyrdom, and those that command violence against non-believers, fuel Yasser's radicalization in prison. He joins a radical Muslim gang for protection and belonging, becomes indoctrinated with a militant interpretation of Islam, emerges from prison as a radicalized leader, orchestrating terrorist plots and seeking to defend Islam through violence. Example from the novel. Yasser's transformation in prison is directly linked to his exposure to radical interpretations of the Quran and hadiths. He memorizes verses about jihad and martyrdom, which become the foundation for his new identity as a religious extremist. 3. Lack of remorse and dehumanization of victims. The belief that violence against non-believers, apostates, and women who dishonor their families is divinely sanctioned removes Yasser's sense of guilt or empathy. He sees himself as an agent of divine justice, not as a criminal. He never expresses genuine remorse for his actions. He rationalizes even the most brutal acts, rape, abandonment, terrorism, as fulfilling religious duty. Example from the novel. Even after being confronted with the suffering he causes, Yasser continues to justify his actions by quoting scripture and hadiths, showing no empathy for his victims. 4. Manipulation of religious and legal systems. Yasser exploits both religious and secular systems to his advantage. In Sudan, he uses Sharia law and patriarchal norms to escape accountability and shift blame onto his victims. In Canada, he attempts to manipulate multicultural and legal loopholes, but ultimately faces consequences due to the secular, rights-based system. Example from the novel. Yasser's ability to move between systems and exploit their weaknesses is a recurring theme, highlighting how his beliefs empower him to act without regard for others. 5. Perpetuation of cycles of violence and oppression. Yasser's actions, justified by his beliefs, perpetuate cycles of trauma, violence, and social breakdown, not just for his direct victims, but for families and communities. Example from the novel. His predatory behavior leads to the destruction of Natasha's family, the death of her mother, and the execution of Natasha herself. In Canada, his actions result in Brittany's trauma and his own imprisonment. Summary table. Impact of Yasser's beliefs. Belief/verse theme impact on Yasser's actions. Jihad and violence justifies abuse, terrorism, and violence. Rewards for martyrdom motivates radicalization and pursuit of extremist goals. Apostasy and punishment rationalizes violence against apostates and dissenters. Patriarchy and polygamy excuses exploitation and control of women. Dehumanization removes empathy, enables cruelty and lack of remorse. In summary, Yasser's interpretation of religious texts provides him with a framework to justify and escalate his abusive, predatory, and violent actions. These beliefs not only shape his personal trajectory from local abuser to transnational terrorist, but also drive the cycles of suffering experienced by those around him. The novel uses Yasser's character to critique how such interpretations, when unchecked, can lead to profound harm at both personal and societal levels. The reactions of others to Yasser's beliefs are wide-ranging and deeply significant to the novel's themes. Here's a detailed summary. 1. Natasha and her family. Victims of betrayal and trauma, Natasha and her parents are devastated by Yasser's predatory actions and his religious justifications for abuse. Natasha suffers lifelong trauma, social stigma, and repeated cycles of violence and exile as a direct result of Yasser's beliefs and refusal to take responsibility. Protective but powerless, her parents, Sammy and Nadia, try to protect her, but are ultimately overwhelmed by the social and legal consequences Yasser's actions bring upon their family. 2. Sudanese society and extended family. Harsh judgment and violence. The broader community reacts with outrage and violence, not toward Yasser, but toward Natasha and her family. The focus is on family honor, leading to threats of honor killing, ostracism, and relentless gossip. Yasser himself largely escapes direct community punishment by fleeing. Enablers and deniers. Many in the community either ignore Yasser's responsibility or rationalize his actions, focusing instead on punishing the female victim and her family. 3. Yasser's wives and associates. Victims and rivals. Yasser's wives, Badriya, Duriya, Maria, are also victims of his manipulation, neglect, and abuse. They sometimes fight among themselves, but Yasser rarely faces consequences from them directly, as he uses religious and cultural justifications to maintain control. Some seek justice. Occasionally, as with Maria and Duriya, there are confrontations and even legal action, but Yasser often escapes accountability by exploiting legal and social loopholes. 4. Legal and religious authorities. Complicity or ineffectiveness. In Sudan, the legal and religious systems are more likely to punish Natasha and her family than Yasser. Even when his crimes are known, the focus of punishment is on the female victim, not the male perpetrator. International and Western authorities. In Canada, Yasser eventually faces criminal charges for sexual assault and child abuse and is imprisoned. However, even then, his past is sometimes overlooked or rationalized by those who see him as a victim of cultural misunderstanding. 5. The broader community. Polarized reactions. Some in the immigrant and religious communities defend Yasser, seeing him as a victim of Western prejudice or as a religious leader. Others, especially women's rights activists and human rights organizations, are horrified by his actions and campaign for justice and reform. 6. Religious and cultural groups. Muslim community. Many Muslims in the diaspora and in Sudan are depicted as upholding the same beliefs as Yasser, especially regarding honor, gender roles, and apostasy. They often react with denial or conspiracy theories when Yasser is accused of crimes, seeing him as a target of anti-Muslim bias. Christian and secular groups. These groups are more likely to see Yasser's beliefs as dangerous and campaign for the protection of victims and for legal reform. 7. Media and activists. Media outcry. Journalists and activists expose Yasser's crimes and the failures of both religious and secular systems to protect victims. They use his case to highlight the dangers of religious extremism and patriarchal laws. Women's rights activists. They demand reforms, abolition of Sharia-based punishments, and protection for women and children from religiously justified violence. Summary table. Group/individual reaction to Yasser's beliefs and actions. Natasha and family trauma. Outrage. Attempts at protection, but ultimately powerless. Extended family/society focus on honor, blame on victim, enablement, or denial of Yasser's actions. Wives/associates victims of abuse, occasional resistance, but often powerless. Legal/religious systems complicit or ineffective in Sudan, more punitive in Canada. Broader community polarized, some defend Yasser, others campaign for justice. Muslim community often in denial, see Yasser as victim or hero, resist criticism. Christian/secular condemn Yasser, advocate for victims, push for reform. Media/activists expose abuses, demand reform, highlight systemic failures. In summary, most characters who are close to Yasser or directly affected by his actions suffer deeply and seek justice or escape. Broader society, both in Sudan and in the diaspora, is often complicit, either by focusing on punishing the female victim, rationalizing Yasser's behavior, or failing to hold him accountable. Only in rare instances, such as through the intervention of Western legal systems or human rights advocates, does Yasser face real consequences, and even then, he often manipulates the system to his advantage. The media plays a crucial role in exposing Yasser's actions and the broader injustices of the systems that enable him. Here's how the media's role is depicted in the novel. 1. Exposing Yasser's crimes and past. The media investigates and publishes details about Yasser's criminal record, both in Sudan and Canada. Journalists uncover his history of sexual abuse, manipulation, and his role in the destruction of Natasha's family, including the honor killing of her mother and the execution of Natasha herself. After Yasser's crimes in Canada against Brittany, the media digs into his immigration file and discovers that he was wanted in Sudan for similar offenses and that he was granted refugee status in Canada despite his past. 2. Bringing international attention. Natasha's trial and punishment in Sudan receive extensive international media coverage. The case becomes a matter of concern for the international community, with human rights organizations and foreign journalists highlighting the brutality of Sharia law and the plight of women like Natasha. The media's attention leads to public outcry and pressure on Sudanese authorities, although it cannot ultimately save Natasha. 3. Highlighting systemic failures. The media contrasts the treatment of victims and perpetrators in Sudan and Canada, showing how Yasser escapes justice in one system but is held accountable in another. Journalists and activists use Yasser's story to critique both religious and secular systems that fail to protect women and children from abuse. 4. Amplifying victims' voices. The media gives a platform to Natasha's story, turning her into a symbol of resistance against oppressive systems. By publicizing her ordeal, the media helps to break the silence around issues of honor, gender violence, and religious extremism. 5. Influencing public opinion and policy. Media coverage sparks debates about immigration policy, women's rights, and the dangers of religious extremism. The exposure of Yasser's actions leads to calls for reform, both in the countries depicted and in the international community. Example from the novel. The media wrote extensively about Yasser's past criminal records in Sudan and Canada, as well as his recent records in those 3 countries where he has 3 Muslim wives. An old article from the archive was pulled out and published in 2 pages in one of the widely read newspapers in Calgary. The article is dated 20 years ago. The article mentioned in detail the adultery charges that were laid on Sheikh Yasser Saif al-Din and made the Sharia court in Khartoum to condemn him as guilty of committing adultery twice with a young woman by the name of Natasha Sami Shams al-Din. Summary table. Media's role. Function, impact on Yasser and society. Investigative reporting uncovers Yasser's crimes and past. International coverage brings global attention to injustice. Systemic critique highlights failures of religious/secular systems. Victim advocacy amplifies Natasha's and other victims' voices. Policy influence sparks debate and calls for reform. In summary, the media acts as a watchdog, exposing Yasser's crimes, challenging the systems that protect abusers, and giving a voice to victims. Its investigative work not only brings Yasser's actions to light, but also fuels broader social and legal debates about justice, gender, and human rights. Yasser's response to media exposure is complex and evolves as his situation changes. 1. Initial evasion and denial. When the media in Sudan and later in Canada begin to expose his crimes, sexual abuse, manipulation, and the destruction of Natasha's family, Yasser's first response is to evade accountability. He flees Sudan, manipulates the refugee system, and presents himself as a victim rather than a perpetrator. He never publicly admits guilt or remorse. Instead, he rationalizes his actions, often using religious or cultural justifications. 2. Manipulation and reinvention. In Canada, as media and legal scrutiny increase, Yasser reinvents himself. After serving time in prison, he emerges as a devout Muslim leader, using his charisma and religious knowledge to gain influence within immigrant and Muslim communities. He turns his criminal past into a testimony, claiming he was persecuted for following Islamic tradition and law, and presents himself as a misunderstood or even heroic figure to his followers. 3. Playing the victim and exploiting sympathy. Yasser and his supporters often frame media exposure as evidence of anti-Muslim bias or Western prejudice. He claims he is being targeted for his faith and culture, not for his crimes. His wives, followers, and some community members defend him, insisting that accusations are conspiracies or fabrications by enemies of Islam or jealous rivals. 4. Retaliation and escalation. When media exposure leads to legal consequences or threatens his reputation, Yasser retaliates through manipulation, rumor spreading, and even violence. For example, he orchestrates rumors and character assassination against those who challenge him or threaten to reveal the truth. He escalates his activities, eventually masterminding terrorist plots and using his notoriety to recruit and radicalize others. 5. Public image management. Despite mounting evidence and media coverage, Yasser maintains a public image of piety and leadership among his followers. He receives awards, is celebrated in some circles, and continues to attract support, especially from those who share his worldview or feel threatened by Western criticism. 6. Private rage and paranoia. Privately, Yasser is enraged and fearful about the impact of media exposure. He worries about losing his status, being prosecuted, or being exposed as a fraud and criminal. When Natasha confronts him with media evidence of his past, he is furious and plots to silence her, showing that exposure threatens his sense of control and power. Key example from the novel. After the notorious polygamist and child abuser, Sheikh Yasser Saif al-Din has been officially placed under house arrest in Calgary by the order of the criminal court. The media wrote extensively about his past criminal records in Sudan and Canada, as well as his recent records in those 3 countries where he has 3 Muslim wives. An old article from the archive was pulled out and published in 2 pages in one of the widely read newspapers in Calgary. The article mentioned in detail the adultery charges that were laid on Sheikh Yasser Saif al-Din and made the Sharia court in Khartoum to condemn him as guilty of committing adultery twice with a young woman by the name of Natasha Sami Shams al-Din. If he denied the relationship, Natasha would take him to court and prove his fatherhood to her through a DNA test. He would not be able to refuse to follow the court order to conduct a paternity DNA test. On the other hand, if he admitted the relation, then he would be publicly disgraced among the Muslim Sudanese community and lose his respect among his followers in the Muhajirin group. Summary table. Yasser's response to media exposure. Stage/strategy. Yasser's response. Evasion/denial. Flees, denies, rationalizes, never admits guilt. Manipulation. Reinvents as religious leader, uses testimony. Playing victim. Claims persecution, blames anti-Muslim bias. Retaliation. Spreads rumors, orchestrates violence, silences critics. Image management. Maintains pious public persona, seeks awards. Private rage. Plots revenge, fears loss of power and exposure. In summary, Yasser responds to media exposure with denial, manipulation, and escalation. He never accepts responsibility, instead using every tool, religion, community, and even violence, to protect his image and silence those who threaten to reveal the truth. The novel uses his reaction to media scrutiny to highlight the dangers of unchecked power, the complicity of communities, and the challenges of seeking justice in the face of systemic denial. Yasser turns his criminal record into a powerful testimony by reframing his past crimes as acts of religious devotion and persecution, rather than as abuse and exploitation. Here's how he does it, based on the novel's content. 1. Reinvention as a religious leader. After serving time in prison in Canada for sexual offenses, Yasser emerges as a devout Muslim leader. He uses his knowledge of the Quran and his charismatic personality to gain influence within immigrant and Muslim communities. 2. Recasting his crimes as religious persecution. Yasser reinterprets his criminal record, including child abuse, polygamy, and statutory rape, not as crimes, but as the result of faithfully following Islamic tradition and being persecuted by Western secular laws. He claims he was punished for practicing polygamy and marrying young girls, which he presents as lawful and honorable in Islam. 3. Fabricating a testimony. He constructs a narrative in which he rescued a vulnerable girl, Brittany, from the streets, converted her to Islam, and married her to save her from a life of sin. His marriage to a 14-year-old is justified by the example of the Prophet Muhammad, who married Aisha at a young age. The Canadian legal system, by prosecuting him, is portrayed as anti-Muslim and hostile to Islamic values. 4. Gaining sympathy and legitimacy. Yasser shares this testimony widely in mosques and among his followers, turning his criminal past into a story of religious endurance and martyrdom. He claims to have suffered for his faith, which wins him sympathy and admiration from those who share his worldview or feel threatened by Western criticism. 5. Using his story for recruitment and influence. He leverages his testimony to recruit new followers and converts, justify his leadership of religious and even extremist groups, deflect criticism and legal scrutiny by framing himself as a victim of religious discrimination. Example from the novel. He is well known for his remarkable testimony. As a matter of fact, Sheikh Saif al-Din turned his nasty past criminal record into a powerful testimony that moved the hearts of those who heard it. Whenever he traveled to a Muslim country, he shared that testimony. According to his testimony, he was condemned as a dangerous criminal and convicted as a child abuser because he just followed the blessed sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad. His only crime was that he married a 14-year-old girl who was converted to Islam in his hands. Instead of rewarding him for saving the life of a street girl, Sheikh Yasser Saif al-Din was arrested and thrown behind bars. Then his lawful marriage with that street girl was interpreted by a Canadian criminal court as kidnap and rape. Summary table. Yasser's testimony strategy. Step how Yasser uses it. Reinvention becomes a devout Muslim leader. Recasting crimes frames abuse as religious persecution. Fabricated testimony claims to have saved victims, not abused them. Gaining sympathy portrays himself as a martyr for Islam. Recruitment and influence uses story to gain followers and deflect criticism. In summary, Yasser manipulates his criminal record into a narrative of religious faith and persecution, turning his past into a tool for influence, recruitment, and self-protection. The novel uses this transformation to critique how charismatic abusers can exploit religious and cultural narratives to escape accountability and gain power. Yes, Yasser's narrative is challenged by several characters and groups throughout the novel, but with varying degrees of effectiveness and consequence. Who challenges Yasser's narrative? 1. Natasha and her family. Natasha directly confronts Yasser, exposes his abuse, and refuses to be silenced by his religious justifications or manipulations. She tells her story to authorities and the media, even at great personal risk. Sami Shams al-Din, Natasha's father, stands against the prevailing honor culture and refuses to kill or abandon his daughter, openly criticizing the religious and social systems that protect men like Yasser. 2. The media and human rights activists. Journalists investigate Yasser's past, publish details of his crimes, and expose the hypocrisy in his self-portrayal as a victim or religious martyr. International media coverage and human rights organizations highlight the brutality of the systems that allow Yasser to escape accountability, and they campaign for justice for victims like Natasha. 3. Legal and secular authorities. In Canada, the secular legal system does not accept Yasser's religious justifications for his crimes. He is prosecuted, convicted, and imprisoned for his actions against Brittany and others. Canadian courts reject the argument that his actions are protected by religious or cultural tradition and instead treat them as criminal offenses. 4. Women's rights activists and reformers. Women's rights groups and reform-minded individuals use Yasser's case to demand changes to laws and practices that enable abuse, polygamy, child marriage, and gender-based violence. They challenge the legitimacy of using religious tradition as a shield for predatory behavior. 5. Some community members and victims. Victims like Maria, Daria, and Brittany, as well as their supporters, challenge Yasser's narrative by seeking legal recourse, speaking out, or leaving him. Some members of the Sudanese and immigrant communities are horrified by his actions and push for accountability, though others remain in denial or defend him. How effective are these challenges? In Sudan and among conservative circles, Yasser's narrative is often protected by patriarchal, religious, and cultural norms. Many in his community either believe his version, rationalize his actions, or focus blame on the female victims. In Canada and in the international arena, his narrative is more effectively challenged. The media, courts, and activists expose his crimes, and he faces real consequences, though he continues to manipulate some followers and exploit cultural divides. Within his own circles, Yasser maintains influence by recasting himself as a martyr and religious leader, but his reputation is repeatedly threatened by exposure and legal action. Key example from the novel. After the notorious polygamist and child abuser, Sheikh Yasser Saif al-Din has been officially placed under house arrest in Calgary by the order of the criminal court, the media wrote extensively about his past criminal records in Sudan and Canada. An old article from the archive was pulled out and published in 2 pages in one of the widely read newspapers in Calgary. The article mentioned in detail the adultery charges that were laid on Sheikh Yasser Saif al-Din and made the Sharia court in Khartoum to condemn him as guilty of committing adultery twice with a young woman by the name of Natasha Sami Shams al-Din. Summary table. Who challenges Yasser's narrative? Challenger method of challenge effectiveness. Natasha and family direct confrontation, testimony, exposure high personal cost, limited systemic change in Sudan, more effective in Canada. Media and activists investigative reporting, advocacy raises awareness, pressures authorities, exposes hypocrisy. Legal/secular authorities prosecution, legal rejection of justifications effective in Canada, limited in Sudan. Women's rights groups public campaigns, legal reform efforts drives debate, pushes for change. Some community members' social pressure, support for victims mixed, often met with denial or backlash. In summary, Yasser's narrative is challenged by victims, family, the media, legal systems, and activists. While he is able to manipulate and maintain his image among some followers, these challenges expose his crimes, undermine his authority, and ultimately lead to his downfall, especially in contexts where secular law and free press prevail. If you'd like, I can provide direct passages or focus on a specific challenger or episode. Let me know how you'd like to proceed. There is no evidence that any Muslim religious leader directly and publicly opposes Yasser within the narrative. In fact, the novel depicts most religious authorities and community leaders in Sudan and the diaspora as either complicit, silent, or supportive of Yasser, especially when his actions are justified using religious or cultural arguments. Key points from the novel. In Sudan, Religious leaders and Sharia court judges are depicted as upholding the same patriarchal and punitive interpretations of Islam that Yasser uses to justify his actions. The Sharia court sentences Natasha to death by flogging for adultery, while Yasser escapes punishment by fleeing the country. There is no mention of any imam, sheikh, or religious figure condemning Yasser's abuse, manipulation, or violence. In Canada, after Yasser reinvents himself as a devout Muslim leader, he is embraced by segments of the Muslim immigrant community. He is even given leadership roles, receives awards, and is celebrated for his testimony. The novel describes how he is able to maintain his influence and respect among his followers, and how his narrative is protected by religious and community solidarity. When accused or exposed. When Yasser is accused of crimes or his past is exposed by the media, his supporters, including religious leaders, often defend him, claim he is a victim of anti-Muslim bias, or dismiss the accusations as conspiracies. For example, after the rape and attempted murder of Natasha, Yasser's Pakistani wife and her father, the imam of the mosque, demand a DNA test to clear Yasser, and the broader Muslim community rallies to his defense, refusing to believe the charges. No internal reformers. The novel does not present any Muslim religious leader who stands up against Yasser's abuse, challenges his interpretation of Islam, or advocates for justice for his victims. Instead, the only opposition comes from secular authorities, women's rights activists, the media, and victims themselves. Summary table. Religious leader/group stance toward Yasser notes. Sudanese Sharia judges supportive/complicit punish Natasha, ignore Yasser's crimes. Imams in Canada supportive/defensive defend Yasser, demand DNA test, deny accusations. Muslim community leaders supportive/defensive celebrate Yasser, see him as a victim or hero. Reformist/progressive leaders not depicted, no evidence of opposition or reform in the novel. In summary, no religious leader in the novel directly opposes Yasser or challenges his narrative. The lack of internal religious critique is a deliberate theme in the book, highlighting the dangers of unchecked religious authority and the silence or complicity of those in power. There are no prominent reformist religious leaders depicted in the novel who openly challenge the dominant patriarchal or religious structures from within the Muslim community. The narrative repeatedly emphasizes the absence of internal religious critique and highlights how religious authorities and community leaders are either complicit, silent, or supportive of the status quo and of Yasser's actions. However, there are reformist voices in other forms. 1. Secular and human rights voices. Natasha's father, Sami Shams al-Din, is an atheist and openly criticizes the religious and social systems that perpetuate violence and injustice, especially regarding honor culture and the treatment of women. International media, human rights organizations, and women's rights activists are depicted as reformist voices. They campaign for justice, criticize Sharia-based punishments, and call for legal and social reforms to protect women and children. 2. Victims and survivors as reformist voices. Natasha herself becomes a reformist voice by refusing to be silenced, speaking out about her abuse and advocating for change. Her journey into religious studies and her later academic work on women in Islam are portrayed as efforts to expose and challenge oppressive traditions. Other female characters, such as Maria and Duriya, resist or escape abusive marriages, and their actions, though not always overtly reformist, represent personal acts of resistance against patriarchal norms. 3. The novel's narrative stance. The author's voice and the structure of the novel itself serve as a reformist critique, exposing the harms of rigid religious and cultural codes and advocating for compassion, secularism, and universal human rights. What is missing? No Muslim religious leader or imam in the novel stands up against Yasser or the system. The lack of internal religious reformers is a deliberate theme, highlighting the dangers of unchecked religious authority and the silence or complicity of those in power. Summary table. Reformist voice type example in the novel effectiveness/impact. Secular/human rights Sami Shams Aldin, media, activists raise awareness, push for reform. Victims/survivors Natasha, Maria, Daria personal resistance, advocacy. Narrative/authorial the novel's critique of Sharia and patriarchy exposes injustice, calls for change. Religious leaders none depicted as reformist absence is a key theme. In summary, while there are strong reformist and critical voices in the novel, especially from secular, academic, and activist perspectives, there are no internal Muslim religious reformers depicted. The novel's critique is largely external or comes from those who have left or been marginalized by the religious system. The novel provides several reasons, both explicit and implied, for why religious leaders do not oppose Yasser or challenge the injustices perpetuated in the name of religion. 1. Complicity with patriarchal and religious norms. Religious leaders and Sharia court judges are depicted as upholding the same patriarchal and punitive interpretations of Islam that Yasser uses to justify his actions. They enforce laws and customs that prioritize family honor, male authority, and religious conformity over justice or compassion for victims. The Sharia court, for example, sentences Natasha to death by flogging for adultery, while Yasser escapes punishment by fleeing. There is no mention of any imam, sheikh, or religious figure condemning Yasser's abuse, manipulation, or violence. 2. Protection of community reputation. Religious leaders are shown to be more concerned with protecting the reputation of the Muslim community than with seeking justice for victims. When Yasser is accused or exposed by the media, his supporters, including religious leaders, often defend him, claim he is a victim of anti-Muslim bias, or dismiss the accusations as conspiracies. For example, after the rape and attempted murder of Natasha, Yasser's Pakistani wife and her father, the imam of the mosque, demand a DNA test to clear Yasser, and the broader Muslim community rallies to his defense, refusing to believe the charges. 3. Fear of undermining religious authority. Challenging Yasser would mean questioning the very religious and cultural foundations that give these leaders their authority. The novel suggests that to oppose Yasser would be to admit flaws in the system they uphold, which could undermine their own power and legitimacy. 4. Absence of internal reformers. The novel explicitly highlights the lack of internal religious reformers. No Muslim religious leader stands up against Yasser's abuse, challenges his interpretation of Islam, or advocates for justice for his victims. Instead, the only opposition comes from secular authorities, women's rights activists, the media, and victims themselves. 5. Social and cultural pressures. The broader community, including religious leaders, often focuses on punishing the female victim and her family rather than holding male perpetrators accountable. This reflects deep-rooted social and cultural pressures to maintain the status quo and avoid scandal. Summary table. Reasons for religious leaders' silence. Reason how it manifests in the novel. Complicity with patriarchal norms enforcing Sharia punishments, ignoring male abuse. Protection of community reputation defending Yasser, blaming victims, denying accusations. Fear of undermining authority, avoiding critique of religious/cultural foundations. Absence of internal reformers, no imam or sheikh challenges Yasser or the system. Social/cultural pressures focus on honor, silence, and punishing women. In summary, religious leaders are silent because they are invested in maintaining the existing religious and social order, which protects their authority and the community's reputation, even at the expense of justice and compassion. The novel uses this silence to critique the dangers of unchecked religious authority and the complicity of those in power.